Good day or good evening, whatever applies to you. Welcome to the 12th episode in the series. Here we will examine the evidence for the great flood of Noah's day and compare it to the Genesis record. I'm Dick Fisher. With me is my co-host, Ken Miller. We saw in previous episodes that the judgment of the flood was upon Adam's generations. They were accountable. Under the influence of the nearby Sumerians, the covenant race, the Adamic race, became corrupt. God's grace could no longer keep them from judgment. The sword of the Spirit came by the way of a purifying flood.
According to Jewish historian Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, violence and wickedness was prevalent in the days preceding the flood. Genesis records that the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. This is what Genesis 6:11 through 13 has to say. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth.
We should know by now that the flood was local to southern Mesopotamia. It terminated the sinful Adamite race and brought death to the domesticated animals with them, plus whatever wild animals that may have been living in the Euphrates basin at the time. So Genesis 6:11-13 is an excellent passage of Scripture to examine. However, just reading the verse in English as translated could cause one to believe that the flood was more extensive than that. The easiest correction to make is changing earth to land, understanding that the Hebrew word eretz does double duty, and it can carry either meaning depending on the context. The next accommodation involves the term all flesh, used twice in these verses. Here we have to do a little sleuthing. The ancient Hebrews didn't leave us a Hebrew grammar book where we could just look up Hebrew terminology. We have to study Scripture to determine the rules. Genesis 2:23-24 helps us define the word flesh. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So the flesh that is to be destroyed is human flesh.
The word all in this Genesis 6:13 is defined by usage. Genesis 41 relates to the account of Joseph, who was called by Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. Joseph told Pharaoh 7 lean years in Egypt would follow 7 years of plenty. Then Joseph was set up as overseer and directed that some of the corn growing during the plentiful years would be set aside to cover the lean years. We read in Genesis 41:48, And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt.
I think we can assume that during the 7 years of plenty, the resident Egyptians ate some food. It is doubtful they could have found a way to save it all. Yet this is a manner of speech that was prevalent at the time. In Hebrew parlance, all and every appears where we might say much, many, or some.
In the same story of Joseph, and all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn. Genesis 41:57.
That is to say, the nearby countries in the vicinity of Egypt came to buy corn. No one showed up from Peru or China or Madagascar. Today, the word totally has found its way into American jargon. Someone might say, for example, I am totally exhausted. and we fully realize their state of exhaustion, whatever it may be, falls short of being total.
I totally understand that.
Awesome. Let's revisit the passage and see how it should be understood. This is Genesis 6:11-13, translated in light of what we now know. The land also was corrupt before God, and the land was filled with violence. And God looked upon the land, and behold, it was corrupt. For Adam's generations had corrupted their way upon the land. And God said unto Noah, The end of Adam's generations is come before me, for the land is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the land.
Noah begins to take center stage in Genesis 6. Genesis tells us that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, that he was a just man, perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God.
Josephus echoes that, saying that God loved Noah for his righteousness. The writer of Jubilees confirms that Noah was perfect in his generations by including a little more information. Noah took to himself a wife, and her name was Amzara, the daughter of Rachiel, the daughter of his father's brother. Noah's father's brother would be his uncle, and Amzara would have been his uncle's granddaughter, Noah's first cousin once removed. In fact, the writer of Jubilees diligently recorded the names of all of the wives of all of Adam's descendants from Seth through Noah, including the wives of Noah's 3 sons. Whereas the writer of Genesis simply summed it all up by telling us Noah was perfect in his generations, the writer of Jubilees provided proof by naming the wives and telling us something about their ancestry until he got to Noah's sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And here he just listed the names of the 3 wives without saying anything about where they came from, although their names are of non-Semitic origin, indicating they came from the indigenous population, Sumerian or Ubadan, if there were any Ubadans left by the time of the flood.
Genesis 6:14 initiates the account of the flooding, beginning with the instruction God gives to Noah to build the ark. Jewish historian Josephus wrote, Accordingly, he entered into the ark, and his wife and sons and their wives, and put into it not only other provisions to support their wants there, but also sent in with the rest all sorts of living creatures, the male and his female, for the preservation of their kinds, and others of them by 7s. Now this ark had firm walls and a roof, and was braced with cross beams, so that it could not be any way drowned or overborne by the violence of the water. And thus was Noah with his family preserved.
A clay tablet recovered from Nippur, biblical Kalna, contained about 300 lines written in Sumerian cuneiform, with the first 37 lines missing. The coming of the flood is revealed to Ziusudra by way of a subterfuge. The wise Enki, who was high in the council of the gods, knows the flood is imminent, but was supposed to keep it a secret. Instead, he speaks out to the wall of Ziusudra's hut, with Ziusudra hearing his words.
The legend of Atrahasis repeats the same theme. Ea, the Akkadian name for the Sumerian Enki, speaks out. Wall, hearken to me. Read hut, guard well all my words. Destroy the house, build a ship, renounce worldly goods, keep the soul alive.
Josephus records, Now God loved this man for his righteousness, yet he not only condemned those other men for their wickedness, but determined to destroy the whole race of mankind, and to make another race that should be pure from wickedness, and cutting short their lives, and making their years not so many as they formerly lived, but 120 only. He turned the dry land into sea, and thus were all these men destroyed, but Noah alone was saved.
To see the commonalities between accounts, the following flood texts listed in order of writing are from Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh in for Semitic languages, Genesis 6 through 9, and the account from Babylonian historian Berosus.
Knowing the flood was ordered by the council of the gods, Enki warns our flood hero by speaking to the wall of his hut. Side wall, pay attention, it says in Ziusudra. Wall, pay attention, from the legend of Gilgamesh. This is an example of what reed huts in southern Iraq look like today, just as they did 5,000 years ago. The 11th tablet of Gilgamesh and Genesis agree. It was a condition of the heart that led to the flood. When their heart led the great gods to produce the flood in Gilgamesh, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, it says in Genesis. Decisions were made. The great gods decided to make a flood in Gilgamesh. God decided to make an end of all flesh, it says in Genesis. And a warning went out. He, Enki, told him of the coming of the flood in Atrahasis. God said to Noah, I will bring a flood in Genesis. And Berosus told the Babylonians it was Kronos who said mankind would be destroyed by a flood. The means for saving the faithful remnant comes into focus, described as the huge boat in Ziusudra. The command is to build a ship in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. And God commands Noah to make yourself an ark in Genesis. 10 dozen cubits, the height of each of her walls, is the height of it in Gilgamesh. And 300 cubits in Genesis, the breadth of it 50 cubits. According to the Sumerian version, it was Ziusudra who protected the seed of mankind. Bring into the ship the seed of all life, it says in Gilgamesh, and Genesis desires to keep their seed alive. Like the Absu, you shall roof it in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. The Absu is the underground waters. And Genesis says, make a roof for the ark. Pitch I poured into the inside in Gilgamesh. Cover inside and out with pitch in Genesis. Some people scrape pitch off the boat in Berosus. Your family, your relatives, appears in one version of Atrahasis, and he sent his family on board in another version. Into the ship all my family and relatives in Gilgamesh, and come thou and all thy house into the ark in Genesis. Animals which emerge from the earth, it says in Ziusudra, clean animals and of animals that are not clean in Genesis, and put both birds and animals on board in Berosus. Enter the boat and close the boat's door, it says in Atrahasis. I entered the boat and closed the door in Gilgamesh, and they that entered, and the Lord shut him in Genesis. The storm had swept for 7 days and 7 nights in Ziusudra. For 7 days and 7 nights came the storm, says Atrahasis. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came, it says in Genesis. Consigned the peoples to destruction in Atrahasis. All mankind was turned to clay in Gilgamesh, and all flesh died, and every man in Genesis. Below the fountain of the deep was stopped in Atrahasis. The fountains also of the deep were stopped, it says in Genesis. In the film version of Noah, the flood is depicted as a global catastrophe. The fountains of the deep are shown as massive underground water-spewing volcanoes. In Sumerian and Akkadian, the word fountains applies to irrigation equipment, and the deep refers to any body of water, such as a river or canal. It's a direct reference to irrigation. A visitor touring southern Iraq can see fountains of the deep still operating today, irrigating their fields with water from canals, just as the Sumerians and Akkadians did thousands of years ago. From the legend of Ziusudra, Ziusudra made an opening in the large boat. I opened the window, it says in Gilgamesh. In Genesis, Noah opened the window of the ark. And Berosus says he pried open a portion of the boat. On Mount Nasur, the boat grounded, it says in Gilgamesh. The ark came to rest upon the mountains, says Genesis, and the boat had grounded upon a mountain in Berosus. The dove went out and returned in Gilgamesh. He sent forth the dove, and the dove came back to him in Genesis, and he let out the birds, and they again returned to the ship in Berosus. Then I set forth and set free a raven in Gilgamesh, and he set forth a raven in Genesis. He offered a sacrifice in Gilgamesh. He offered burnt offerings on the altar in Genesis, and he built an altar and sacrificed to the gods in Berosus. The gods smelled the sweet savor in Gilgamesh, and the Lord smelled the sweet savor in Genesis. That I may remember it every day, it says in Atrahasis. I shall remember these days and never forget in Gilgamesh. I shall remember my covenant. I may remember in Genesis. He touched our foreheads to bless us in Gilgamesh. And Genesis says, and God blessed Noah. Go down to dwell with my Lord Ea in Gilgamesh. Noah walked with God in Genesis, and he had gone to dwell with the gods, it says in Berosus.
A Sumerian composition includes the following text as spoken by the benevolent god Enki. After the assembly had made the flood sweep over, it was the seed of mankind that we were to destroy. Among us, I was the only one for life, and he remained alive. Ziusudra kept the name of humankind alive.
It would be difficult to argue that these extra-biblical texts are not related to Genesis. Opinions vary as to why they do. Some will argue that Genesis was composed in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity from 597 to 538 BC, and the Hebrew scribes simply borrowed wholesale from existing Mesopotamian literature. This view also became popular due to the prevailing belief that during the Exodus from Egypt time frame, the ability to compose such a text was lacking. With the discovery of the Amarna tablets in 1887, written in Akkadian and dated to the reigns of Amenhotep III, who reigned from 1402 to 1364 BC, and Amenhotep IV, who ruled from 1350 to 1334 BC, this argument has been disproven. Israelite scribes certainly had the ability to write, and they had access to the great libraries and literature while in Egypt.
We also have no idea how much literature was available at that time and was lost during these turbulent periods when wars raged, cities sacked, and libraries destroyed.
The scope of the flood is another point of controversy. Was it local or global? None of the Mesopotamian accounts even hint at a worldwide flood. All are placed within the Euphrates basin.
Artists' impressions show the influence of the global flood model, a monstrous ship set upon the high seas, battered by waves.
By contrast, this cylinder seal impression was recovered from Uruk, biblical Erech, and dated by archaeologists to the 3rd millennium BC. By his relative size and dress, we can tell the man in the middle of the boat is a king. He is not a Sumerian, although the boatmen on either side obviously are. Now, what would a Mesopotamian king be doing on a boat loaded with crates and animals?
Then why are there so many people who think the flood enveloped the entire globe?
Part of it is tradition, a misunderstanding that has endured for centuries. Part of it is that the translation from Hebrew into English was performed by translators who labored within the same tradition, choosing their English equivalents to reflect a global flood. And part of it is due to the requirement by creationists that the entire world must be on the order of 6,000 years of age or so and a worldwide flood is necessary to sequence the fossil record. Otherwise, the fossil record would be laid down in time, a result of hundreds of millions of years of deposition all over the world, and they don't allow any time. So, for a variety of reasons, the notion of a worldwide flood persists despite a mountain of evidence to the contrary.
Also, animals died in the flood. It would be well nigh impossible for animals from all over the world to make their way to the ark and then find their way back to where they came from after the voyage.
Writing in 1954, Bernard Ramm wrote, "The flood was local to the Mesopotamian valley. The animals that came, prompted by divine instinct, were the animals of that region. They were preserved for the good of man after the flood. Man was destroyed within the boundaries of the flood. The record is mute about man in America or Africa or China."
We have heard that flood stories are common throughout the world, and that suggests a worldwide flood. So what about the flood stories that permeate the mythology of remote populations?
What we find is that the differences more than offset the similarities. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible deflates the idea that flood stories from different parts of the world might be related to the biblical account. At one time, this widespread distribution of a flood tradition was considered proof of the historicity of the biblical account, which, with some expected modification, had spread throughout the world as people migrated from their original homeland in the Near East. This notion has necessarily been given up. We know, for example, that numerous peoples have no flood legends in their literature. Flood stories are almost entirely lacking in Africa, occur only occasionally in Europe, and are absent in many parts of Asia. They are widespread in America, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific. In addition, many of the known flood legends differ radically from the biblical story and stand independently of it and of one another. Many do not know a worldwide flood at all, but only a local inundation. Often the heroes saved themselves in boats or by scaling mountains without intervention by the gods. Furthermore, only a few of the flood stories give the wickedness of man as the cause for the flood. The duration of the flood, if given, varies from a few days to many years. Facts of this kind disprove the claim that the biblical account is the parent of all flood stories. And further, there is one flood tradition which bears such striking resemblance to the biblical story that it must be directly related to it. That is the cuneiform Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian tradition.
Also, early missionaries had an impact on the mythology of primitive peoples. The biblical account of the Great Flood, related by missionaries, would become interwoven with ancient tribal stories to produce hybrid myths that would mimic Genesis.
Theodore Gaster authored the book Myth, Legend, and Custom in the Old Testament. He wrote, "No flood story can be traced in Sanskrit until after elements of the Aryan civilization began to arrive in India. The Nestorian Christian missionary attempts in China stand out as the source of the flood story amongst the Lolos people."
According to Gleason Archer, who wrote a survey of Old Testament introduction, the list of descendants in the respective lines of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, as recorded in Genesis 10, does not permit an easy identification with the remoter races who lived in the lower reaches of Africa, Far East Asia, Australia, and the Americas, particularly in the case of Australia, with its peculiar fauna indicating a long period of separation from the Eurasian continent. The difficulty of assigning either the humans or the subhuman population with the passengers in the ark has been felt to be acute.
In other words, the Bible is silent on any possible relationship between the descendants of Noah and the Asian race or Native Americans who descended from the Asians, or black Africans, or the Aborigines who populated Australia, or blonde-haired Scandinavians, not to exclude any racial group, that squares exactly with what we know about the antiquity of those races of peoples who were far distant from the Mesopotamian plain at 5,000 years ago. In our next episode, we will look at the date of the flood and examine the places where the ark could have landed, both the probable and the improbable. Don't hesitate to email me if there are any questions over the material we have covered. It's a lot to take in. Just keep in mind there are 3 ways to view the material in Genesis 2 through 11. Some believe it is true human history. Some say it is made up human history. Or it could be authentic Semitic history, the history of the covenant race, not the human race. The sheer weight of an abundance of evidence falls on that answer. Thank you for spending time with us, and thanks to Ken Miller, my co-host.